Ladies and gentlemen, Vice Rector Magnificus, colleagues and students, good morning and welcome to this debate on an important but also a very difficult question: who does the university belong to? A very warm welcome to Professor Stefan Collini of Cambridge University, who has presented such an inspiring and a thought-provoking lecture on this topic yesterday during the official opening of the academic year. We are delighted that you are here and that you are willing to be with us also today and to join a debate about your and about our views on the university, its values, and its role in society. I should also add that those of you who have not yet read Professor Collini's elegant and learned book, What Are Universities For?, will be able to purchase a copy today, either in English or in Dutch translation. Our local bookshop, Koiker, is present in the restaurant, as you may have seen. And I have been informed that Professor Collini is happy to put his signature wherever you want it. In the book, I should add. My name is Casper de Jonge. I'm assistant professor of ancient Greek language and literature at this university, and I feel very honored to be invited to chair this meeting. Before announcing the program of today and before introducing the other speakers in this debate, I would like to invite Professor Simone Buitendijk, Vice Rector Magnificus of this university, who will welcome you on behalf of the Executive Board of Leiden University. Professor Buitendijk, we are delighted that you are here with us, and I know that many people present in this room are grateful for the fact that the board has organized this debate on the role and function of the university. These are very urgent topics and also very relevant to all members of the academic community. And this year the discussion in the Netherlands has been more vigorous than ever. So we are very pleased that you are here, Professor Buitendijk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Casper, and thank you for being here. Thank you for wanting to chair this session. I know you put a lot of time and effort into it, and I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. And I feel very privileged that I'm actually allowed to introduce this debate, because it's true, it's very topical. There's a lot of discussion in the Netherlands right now about the role of the university in society. And as an administrator, you're always in a little bit of a precarious position, and I'm very aware of that. And today I feel I'm even more in a precarious position. And I was actually thinking last night about your anecdote, Professor Collini, about your 21-year-old self talking to the absolute expert on utilitarianism and feeling like you knew everything about it. Today is the exact day that I've been in this role for 4 years. It's the first day of my next 4 years. So that's a very short period of time. To be talking to you as an expert and to all these other experts that are here, the people who've been working at this university for so much longer, makes me feel a little bit like you must have felt when you were 21 years old. I have two advantages though. There are lots of people who will actually lead the debate, 7 distinguished colleagues, so I can sit back a little bit. And I'm very aware of the fact that you're the world expert on this topic, so I know that I'm not going to say things that I, in retrospect, may feel are completely uncalled for. So let me introduce you again, and probably unnecessarily so, but still it's a pleasure to do that. You're a professor of intellectual history and English literature at Cambridge University, and you've been involved in debates about the university for a long, long time. And it's wonderful you wrote this very important book, and it's even more wonderful that you're actually willing to come to our university and engage with us in this very important topic. And I think when we're asking the question, what are universities for, we're basically also asking the question, who does the university belong to? And you touched on that in your excellent speech yesterday, which I think we all tremendously enjoyed. I heard lots of really, really positive comments about it. It's very thought-provoking. And you had a whole list of people that may feel that the university belongs to them. The government, the taxpayer, the students, the rector, the vice rector maybe, the professors, support staff. And like a true academic, you ask lots of questions in your book and in your speech, but you answer very few. And I think that's actually the role of academia, to ask many more questions than anybody can answer. And you also talk about how important it is to never be done with answering questions. I think that's research and science and research-intensive education by definition. We're never done with answering questions. So I was thinking about who does the university belong to when I was reading last night on the internet what happened in Amsterdam yesterday, where students weren't allowed to talk on stage at the opening of their academic year. And I know you're going to Amsterdam today or tomorrow? Tomorrow, to talk to them. And one of the reasons that this whole debate with the leadership team, the administration of the university, I think got so out of hand is that it wasn't clear who Amsterdam University belongs to. I think one of the moments in time when Louise Gunning, the president who had to step down, made a mistake is when she came into the Maagdenhuis, the building that houses the administration, that at that point had been occupied by students. And she said, you need to get out of our Maagdenhuis, my Maagdenhuis. And the students were really upset about that because it wasn't her Maagdenhuis. And now maybe the students are going the other way around, because I saw the picture yesterday, the video footage of them protesting in front of the building, that the Lutherse Kerk, where the opening is going to be held. And some of the students held up a sign saying, we are the uni. And I'm not sure that that's true either. And in a way, I think it's wonderful that we all feel that the university belongs to us, because maybe it belongs to all of us, but then who are us? So I'm sure these are questions that are going to be discussed today. And I'm going to listen very, very carefully, because I think that's hugely important for someone who is in the administration, because I feel like I have to take care of so many different parties. I'm responsible for the students' well-being. In the end, finally, I'm responsible for the teachers' and professors' well-being, and we're also being chased by the government, the taxpayer, and the parliament, actually, to do things a certain way. And Dutch parliament is very involved in the role of universities right now. They are sometimes having micro debates about how Leiden University should treat its students and teachers, and that makes it very hard for the leadership, for the rector and vice rector, to actually treat our students and teachers the way we think we should treat them, because we're also dependent on government funding. So there are lots of really wonderful issues to discuss. And there's one paragraph in your book which I thought was particularly interesting, and that's about accreditation and about accountability, and those are buzzwords in the Netherlands right now, and I think they're often very much in the way. And at Leiden University, we're trying to actually lead a debate to talk about much more independence for universities, much more independence for teachers about how they want to teach their students. And what you say in your book is that you believe that the process of reporting, that people feel that accountability, you talk about the fallacy of accountability. That is the belief that the process of reporting on an activity in the approved form provides some guarantee that something worthwhile has been properly done. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's a fallacy. But unfortunately, many of our parliamentarians don't really understand that. And what I have seen these last 4 years is that our staff, our support staff, our professors, our researchers, they're working so incredibly hard. People are so enormously devoted. And the idea that the government needs to come in and make sure that we all do our jobs and that will actually improve the quality of our teaching, I think, is a huge fallacy. And there's one line that I also want to read from your book, which particularly touched me, because I'm often very worried about the level of engagement and dedication that people in the university show. They're working far too hard. I get too many emails sent in the middle of the night when I ask very busy people to do something like today. Casper, would you organize this meeting? Of course Casper organizes the meeting, even though he's far too busy with his own work and it's probably cost him valuable hours of sleep. And somewhere in your book you say, you talk about the system of surveillance and you talk about an alternative, and I really love that line. A system of surveillance designed to make sure that people didn't overwork might actually contribute something towards so-called efficiency. I'm going to remember that one and see what I can do with it. So yeah, what are universities for? Who does the university belong to? You ended yesterday by saying that it's actually universities are for future generations, and I think that's an incredibly important guiding principle. And what we need to make sure is that we preserve them, that we don't destroy them, that we keep the very essence of universities, because everybody understands how incredibly important they are. That's why we all feel ownership. That's why there's such a heavy debate. And I think that's wonderful. That's really good. But if we all remember they don't belong to any one of us, they don't belong to one party, a group of individuals, they actually belong to the future. And I often think of leading a university and teaching students in terms of parenting. There's a lot of the same kind of thinking in parenting. You're not parenting your children because they belong to you. You're not parenting them because they're giving you something back. You parent them because they need to go into the world and become the citizens that you want them to be, and you think you actually have something to give to them, your experience. And I want to end my little introduction by reading a poem that I really love. It's by Khalil Gibran, a Persian poet that lived in the early 20th century, and it's his poem on children. And it reads as follows: "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life does not go backwards, nor dwells in yesterday." So for me, that really signifies something in the way we can also think about our university. So I'm now going to step down and listen to everything that's going to be said and hopefully learn some lessons that I can use in my next 4 years. And I'm really, really looking forward to a very open debate. You told me yesterday you love open debates. I told you the Dutch are very direct, and you said, great, I'm going to put on my boxing gloves. So I hope you're going to need them today, and I really wish for a very lively and insightful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Burton Deck. As you mentioned yesterday, the event, the opening of the academic year in Amsterdam was disrupted by demonstrators who were planning to read a poem. I suppose it was a very different poem from the one that you were reciting a moment ago. But I think it's a very good thing that at Leiden University, administrators and students and colleagues are able to debate these issues together in perhaps a slightly more relaxed atmosphere. And I should also add that our Rector Magnificus, Professor Karel Stolker, apologizes for his absence. He is at the moment chairing a meeting in Amsterdam, so I think we should wish him good luck over there. Who does the university belong to? To students, professors, administrators, to taxpayers, companies, or the government? There is no need to explain to this audience why it is so important to ask this question and to think about it. And Professor Collini has given the best possible introduction to this debate in his opening lecture yesterday. He has told us that there is in fact no easy answer to the question. The university is not owned by anyone particular in the present. The university belongs as much to previous generations as to future generations. And as Stefan Collini eloquently pointed out, we are only the trustees for the present generation of a complex intellectual inheritance that we did not create and which it is not ours to allow to be destroyed. He has also shown that societies have always asked universities to fulfill diverse functions, but at the same time these universities partly resist to these roles and aim to be protected spaces where students and scholars devote themselves to advancing and to deepening human understanding. Now, by way of an alternative, very brief introduction, I would like to draw a parallel from my own discipline, which happens to be classics. The Library of Alexandria in Hellenistic Egypt was a great center of learning. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt collected millions of book scrolls, which they aggressively stole from the ships that arrived in the harbor of Alexandria. They hired librarians to preserve, to edit, and to explain the texts. but the librarians were also teachers, scholars and poets who composed their own texts. And at the same institute there were astronomers and there were physicians who were doing innovative experiments on the human body and advancing the science of medicine. Who did the Library of Alexandria belong to? Many different answers have indeed been given to this question, to the Ptolemaic rulers who wanted to present themselves as the true protectors of Greek culture, to their children who were educated at the library and prepared for a political career, or to the scholars who were examining human texts and the natural world, or to all the people who profited from the scientific research undertaken at the library. The Library of Alexandria performed all of these tasks, but it is now mainly famous for the fact that it deepened the understanding of the human world, that it preserved the Greek learning of the past and passed this tradition on to the next generations so energetically that we are still able to read and to learn from the ancient Greek texts, and even so that people are still sometimes hired at our university to study these texts. I reassure you, we will now quickly leave the ancient world in order to focus on our university and the challenges of our times. Let me briefly explain the program of this debate and introduce the colleagues of Leiden University who will participate in the first round. Our debate will consist of 3 parts. In the first part, several representatives of Leiden University will present short reactions to the address delivered by Professor Collini yesterday at the opening of the academic year. In his rich address, Professor Collini also told us about the 9 great men of the past who were selected for the canon of statues on the facade of Birmingham University, including Plato, Virgil, and Newton. We have not selected 9 men from the past, but 7 women and men of the present time who represent different ages, disciplines, faculties, and institutes of our university. And they are Professor Ira van Dijk, Professor of Modern Dutch Literature, Dr. Tomas Fossum, Assistant Professor of Political Philosophy, Dr. Alex Geurts, Associate Professor of Archaeology, Professor Sandra Groeneveld, Professor in Public Management at the Faculty Campus The Hague, Professor Glenn Newey, Professor of Political Philosophy, Professor Prof Rosenthal, Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the Leiden University Medical Center, and finally Professor Paul Wouters, Professor of Scientometrics and Director of the Center for the Science and Technology Studies. I think we can be very happy with this huge variety of disciplines and perspectives. Welcome to all of you. We are delighted that you are here and that you are willing to share your views on the questions debated today. Now, each of the speakers will have 5 to an absolute maximum of 8 minutes to formulate a response to Professor Collini's lecture. There will be then a very short break in which the so-called brown bag lunch will be distributed. And you are all invited for this free lunch, which, as we hope, will not take more than 10 minutes to distribute. And we also hope that this will facilitate the discussion, the debate in the second part of the meeting. As soon as you have all obtained your lunch, Professor Collini will be invited to respond to the interventions of the Leiden University colleagues. So while you are eating, Professor Collini will be talking, and so we will try to limit the cracking and rustling with the brown bag to an absolute minimum. Then there's a third round. After his response, the debate will be open to all colleagues and students present in this room. You are all invited to participate, asking questions, reacting to what has been said, or adding, of course, new perspectives. We all remember the lively scenes that took place in the debates at Amsterdam University earlier this year, where students used various different gestures and signs in order to express their agreement and disagreement. I think we will not make it that complicated today, but I would like to lay down 3 basic rules. So firstly, please raise your hand if you would like to make a statement so that you can get the microphone. Secondly, please stand up and briefly introduce yourself by mentioning your name and your discipline. And finally, please keep your statement short and to the point so that there can be a fruitful debate indeed and not a series of monologues. We will now start with the first round, so I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Ira van Dijk. And Professor Ira van Dijk is able to compare the situation in the Netherlands with the situation in the UK and the USA, for after studying in England and after a visiting scholarship at the University of California, she became full professor of modern Dutch literature at Leiden University 2 years ago. Her PhD was on typography and poetry, but lately she has shifted her attention to materiality and media in digital culture. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Caspar, for your introduction. And thank you, Professor Collini, for your inspiring lecture and book yesterday. I think the idea that the university is for deep understanding is something we all agree with. It's very hard to disagree with. But what I'd like to pose today is that there's more political sides to this than was addressed in your book and in your lecture. One of the topics, for example, could be, what do we do in the Netherlands with our mother language? What do we do with Dutch in the university? That would be a political and important question. Another question that came up, for example, this week is, what do we do with diversity? We've all seen the pictures of black students tearing down monuments at the campus of Kaapstad and Stellenbosch in the newspapers this week. So this question of diversity is more urgent than we think, or than we seem to think, because we hardly ever really discuss it in the university. So I want to bring it up today. And yesterday, during your lecture, I was offered this nice leaflet on the Night of Art and Knowledge in Leiden, September 19th. And to my surprise, there was the name of just one woman on the leaflet. And unfortunately, she's a singer and not a scientist. So then I thought, surely this is just not a very elaborate program. So I looked online, and it turns out that on the Night of Art and Science in Leiden, next week, there's 15 scientists who speak. Unfortunately, there's 15 men that will speak. And my point is that I think that we really should stop doing this. I mean, it's a mistake. I'm sure people will think, oh, you know, it's just an innocent mistake, but we keep doing this, and I think we have to change it. I told my husband that I wanted to say these things, and he said, oh, no, you shouldn't, then whatever you do, keep it light, keep it light. So, and I was sitting in the train this morning, and I just don't know how to keep this light, because I think it is not light. Right? This morning, I was addressing our first-year students. There were 5 boys and I think 40 girls. And what I had to tell them, I didn't tell them, but what I could have told them is that the boys in that room stand 4 times as much chance as the girls of becoming a PhD. Still, today. An assistant professor today, a woman, stands 2 times less chance of becoming a full professor than a man. Still. So the figures are not very cheerful. And it's a debate, you know, it's not very nice to be in this place and to have to say this, but I think it's a debate that we still have to keep having, and I'd like to have it today. And it plays on 2 levels. One of the levels is the figures, right? In the last free competition round of the National Research Council, the women in that round had 5 times less success than the men. So the figures are not good. So the figures of success is one of the things we have to talk about. And the others are imaging and role modeling. So I think this shouldn't happen anymore. And even I think that we could talk about the boardrooms, for example. In our beautiful academy building, if you sit in the boardroom where I was addressed officially by my fellow professors to welcome me into the community, there are, I think, maybe 80 paintings, and there's only one of a woman. Why don't we change this? I mean, put the paintings in a museum and put some beautiful pictures up there of our young female or old female and black and Indian professors. So I think on both levels we really should change things, and I'm really sorry if this is not a light statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for adding this important perspective. The second speaker of today is Dr. Tomas Fossum, Assistant Professor, Political Philosophy. His research focuses on current political philosophy, and last year he obtained an NWO Veni scholarship for his research on the question as to how people can judge the legitimacy of governments. Tomas Fossum, I should ask, is also active in the movement, the New University Leiden, also called Nuit, and so he's very familiar with the issues in this debate. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, well, first of all, to the university leadership for organizing this debate and placing this question on the agenda. Thanks for asking me to participate, and thank you, Professor Collini, especially for your inspiring lecture yesterday. I must confess that I'm very sympathetic to the conception of the university that you presented. In your lecture, you masterfully showed that the question of who owns the university isn't really the right question to ask. The university doesn't belong to anyone in particular, not even to all of us together. And to speak of the university in terms of ownership is to fail to appreciate the dependence of this institution and of the fruit that it bears on a broader context in which the members of this institution engage with members of so many similar institutions in an inherited and ongoing practice of inquiry. To quote from your lecture yesterday, a single isolated university is a mirage. Now this, as I said, strikes me as a compelling picture, so my point will not be to raise any objections, but rather to further probe the implications of this picture. Specifically, I would like to invite you to say more about what this picture implies for how the university should be organized. If no one really owns the university, who is to control and to govern it? And how should we think about the relation between the university and the state? Well, you say fairly little about the distribution of decision-making power. You do make an intriguing suggestion, namely that we should think about the control of the university in terms of trusteeship. And you suggest that we should think about the care for the universities as being entrusted to the current generation as a whole, for the benefit also of future generations. The reality is, in the Netherlands at least, that universities have a board of trustees, but one that is much more narrow in scope. It's called the Raad van Toezicht, or Board of Supervisors, and it's a small group, typically made up of business people, civil servants, politicians, and occasionally an academic. And this board is appointed by the Minister of Education. And it in turn has the right to appoint the executive board, including the Rector Magnificus, who then appoints deans of faculties, who then in turn appoint chairs of institutes. Ultimately, the hierarchy of university administration is formally accountable only to this board of trustees, and hence indirectly to the state. There are councils that represent university staff and students, of course, as we all know, on all levels of governance, but these have an advisory role with very little decision-making power. In short, decisions flow downward through the hierarchy, while accountability for those decisions flows upward. So my question is this consistent with the picture of the university that you've put forward? Or is it in fact a model for university ownership by the state? There is a case to be made, I think, for interpreting your lecture as implying a need for radical reform of university governance. Because the form of inquiry, that is the raison d'être of the university, as you describe it, has certain distinguishing features. It's not so much that it's about knowledge for its own sake, but rather, as you put it yesterday, that, to quote again, the drive towards understanding can never accept an arbitrary stopping point. Or again, another quote, pushing at the boundaries of present understanding is not a secondary or instrumental aim directed just at a particular local outcome, but is the very rationale of those institutions themselves. By implication, it seems to me, there can be no external measure of success that is not itself subject to critique. There's no analog in academia for the maximization of shareholder value in business or the effectiveness in putting out fires for fire brigades. Crucially then, academic inquiry is in principle open-ended and unconstrained by predefined purposes such as solving concrete societal problems or stimulating growth. Those I take to be the characteristics of the enterprise that we're engaged in on the picture that you compellingly present. So what sort of institutional structure fits with this open-ended nature of academic enterprise? What sort of institutions make such open and disinterested questioning possible? I don't have the answers to that question, but it does seem to me that openness and resistance to instrumentalization, especially by the state, need to be institutionalized more strongly than they are at present. And perhaps the only way to maintain in the long term the independence of thought and the freedom of inquiry is if the academic community is in some significant sense self-governing. Any other agency, in particular the state, would be inclined to impose, at least open to the possibility, it would be open to the possibility that it would impose its own standards of success and instrumentalize the academy for its own purposes. So to conclude, my suggestion is that your picture of the university calls for democratization of university governance as we have it now. And I'm very eager to hear whether you agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for these important reflections on the structure, organization, and government of the university. Our next speaker is Dr. Alex Geurts. He is currently Associate Professor at Leiden University in the Faculty of Archaeology and also Assistant Professor Adjunct at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as Academic Director of Argon, the Dutch National Research School of Archaeology. The floor is yours.
Well, my thanks as well to the leadership of the university for organizing this, and especially to Casper for putting all the nuts and bolts into this. I know this must have been quite a task, so thank you. And also thank you for the audience for all the interest here. As many have said before, a very timely and pressing issue, so I'll get right to the point that Professor Collini has again so eloquently raised yesterday and has also written up in his book. Actually, it's quite disconcerting to come back to the university after summer recess and then be confronted by a question that's potentially alarming, such as the one under consideration here. Nonetheless, here we are, September 1. And one may also wonder what there can possibly be left to say in response to the question of whom the university belongs to, as Professor Collini seems to have indeed rather authoritatively reviewed the historical reasons for universities' raison d'être, the current government influence, the assessment culture as part of that involvement, and the management of university along corporate lines. In the end, evaluating all these vectors, he concludes that the ownership is universal. It belongs to all of us. Now, in questioning the issue of university ownership, Professor Collini emphasizes the value of custodianship or trusteeship, viewing the intellectual legacy of past scholars as something to be protected and brought to the fore. Such tasks, I think, are central to university practices as they have been for quite some time, and they materialize through the publication process, the maintenance of libraries, and obviously, importantly, also teaching. In other words, students and faculty members alike have the possibility, and not just the possibility, but also the duty, to access the intellectual inheritance created before their arrival, to further understanding on parts of this legacy, and lastly, and maybe perhaps importantly right now, to attach with society through dialogue. Well, an excellent portrayal of affairs, I believe, befitting a university's strategic plan, wouldn't you say? But there are, of course, problems here as well, and those center on the inherent complexity of universal ownership, if not to say sometimes property rights. And I will briefly mention two realities of the university hampering, I think, such envisioned trusteeship. The first is the dialogue between university and society, and the implicit senses of entitlement vis-à-vis the university that materialize through such dialogue. And surely one example, and a labored point perhaps, is government involvement in what universities do. Having said that, and perhaps I may harvest some critique for saying that here today, I still don't think that the Netherlands is doing too bad of a job when it comes to government dialogue with universities. If we look at the options for building individual research agendas, for example, we can conclude that it's certainly extremely difficult to establish one, and some fields are probably preferenced over others. But once you do receive the trust of the government funding agency, the freedom, the academic research freedom then achieved is quite substantial, and I think probably all one can realistically expect. And I also think that if we take a European comparative perspective, we'll probably conclude a similar thing. Now, a step beyond this is the contemporary concern with the so-called Dutch science agenda, aka Nationale Wetenschapsagenda. And I won't go into this, I'm sure, hopefully anyway, it will show up in the debate, because it's one of these current issues that is actually being formulated as we speak. And I think we need to ask not just questions to the agenda, but also about the agenda itself. So again, I agree with Professor Collini on the characterization of trusteeship, but where and how do we convince our societal speaking partners before they simply decide what needs to happen, I wonder? This is a process that has been happening in the past already. The second concern I have is the makeup of the university itself. Professor Collini provides the relevant quotes here when he invokes the description of universities as being a series of schools and departments held together by a central heating system. Now, it's obvious that universities in the Netherlands tend to suffer from this silo mentality as well, and I only have experience at one venue in the Netherlands, but I have my suspicions about the others. In Leiden, we have overarching bodies called research profiles, and Cambridge, there are strategic research initiatives, and those seem to function reasonably well. And in an ever more distant past, I myself graduated from a research school for non-Western studies, don't ask me for a definition, which is sadly now defunct, but I still do recollect it as some of the more happier times of my academic life because of the encounters with people from different faculties and different disciplines as such. Overall, I would suggest that speaking with one university voice is still all too complicated, and at times this seems to be restricted to the university website. So, in closing, if we are trustees for a co-owned intellectual inheritance, can we do more than fragment this into little bits and pieces? And if not, how can we possibly keep all the stakeholders on board, Professor Collini? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these important concerns and questions. Leiden University also has, as you all know, a campus in The Hague, and I think it's great that the campus The Hague is also represented today in this debate by Professor Sandra Groeneveld, who is a professor of public management at the Institute of Public Administration at the faculty campus The Hague. She teaches in the fields of organization theory and public management, as well as on research methods and techniques. And we are very happy that you're here.
Well, a lot to say, but only 5 minutes to do so, right? Well, first of all, I feel very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And thank you, Professor Collini, for your inspiring lecture yesterday. And, well, it has been repeated several times now, but it is inspiring and very good that we are discussing now and then what the core is of our work. The question, who does the university belong to, maybe needs to remain unanswered. But if we feel the urgency to talk about the essence of the university, because somehow we feel in current times it is at risk, I believe we also need to address the question how universities should be managed. So I'm going to talk about management today, and I hope you don't want to leave the room now, because I think it's important to talk about management. Now, why is this relevant? The current discussions about what universities are for and general discomfort with the way universities are organized both stem from New Public Management, or NPM. New public management was imposed upon universities by the governments, in some countries more so than in others, and that's important, and directly translated into the internal management of universities. It enforced economic values as the main steering criteria. And we are now discussing about what universities are for, because NPM has blurred our view on our goals and to some extent actually has changed what we aim for in our daily work. But if management is the problem, then it should also bring to us the solution. As long as we do not develop an alternative for NPM-style management, the problems haunting universities will simply remain in place. We run the risk of falling into the same trap again if we limit ourselves to a discussion why universities are valuable and what their essence is we should protect. That we again try to measure those values, to control them, the same way as we did before, and run the risk to destroy their internalization. So what kind of management do we need in our organizations? I think we need a management model which builds on the autonomy of professionals. Professional autonomy is required for realizing what universities are for and for avoiding goal displacement and crowding out of intrinsic motivation. And I think we can all agree on this. But professional autonomy itself is still not yet a management tool. Before I continue, I must say that an important caveat regarding the plea for professional autonomy is that it's not, I want to emphasize, it's not about defending privileged positions. It's not about not wanting to be bothered by the outside world. And it's definitely not about turning back to pre-NPM times. Instead, autonomy is a prerequisite to bring professional norms and values to center stage again. And I could add employment security here as well, since this is so much needed to safeguard professionals' autonomy vis-à-vis the public. Who the public is, well, we will discuss that as well, but well, for now, for these 5 minutes, I need to limit myself to the public. I will very briefly list some elements of NPM we love to hate. A focus on quantitative output measures is one of them, and they come with a large amount of rules and red tape. And these indicators are translated directly into targets for subunits within the organization, and that's, well, a fallacy, to individual organizational members. Individual competition is therefore induced, and leadership roles tend to be limited to ticking the boxes. NPM thrives on a division between institutional management on the one hand and academic leadership on the other, and induces centralization. But now, well, the core question is, what's the alternative? Steering instruments, I believe, that rely on professional norms decided upon and assessed through dialogue, and perhaps through discussions we have today. Through discussions like this about the essence of what a university is for. Trust and socialization should replace standardization of outputs and red tape as a primary mechanism of coordination. And such a new management model emphasizes academic research and teaching as a collaborative effort instead of an individual effort. And leadership roles are defined by servant leadership, enabling colleagues' collaboration and development. And perhaps such a management model will also increase the diversity within our institutes. Now, in such a model, institutional management and academic leadership are highly, highly integrated, and decision-making much more decentralized. Now, you would probably say that universities do not have much leeway if their governments keep on thriving on NPM models of governance and keep on cutting back on their budgets. And obviously, it would be very helpful if governments would afford universities more autonomy and if more budget would be directly allocated. However, despite the circumstances, no one forces us to follow the NPM model within our universities. Differences between Dutch universities in their governance as well as employee reactions to it, as we have recently witnessed even yesterday, shows us that there is some room for organizational choice. And I think it's not enough to just discuss and reformulate our goals, be it in the form of a mission statement or during discussions like this. We also need to be explicit about a strategy to achieve them, which also could inspire our governments to change their policies.
Thank you very much, Sandra Groeneveld, for these important perspectives on the management of our universities. I would also like to thank all the speakers so far for being so disciplined and keeping their eye on the time. We are doing very well time-wise. I would now like to return with you to political philosophy with our next speaker, Professor Glenn Newey. His research focuses on political philosophy, principally modern liberalism. And he also knows, I think, very well the British academic world, which is described by Professor Collini in his book, from personal experience, because he was educated at Cambridge University, and his doctoral thesis written at the University of York dealt with rationality and its place in political theory and practice. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just to pick up on that introduction, my knowledge and experience of the UK university sector is the main reason I'm now in the Netherlands. So I'd like to start by repeating the thanks of other participants, both to the organisers of this event and most particularly to Professor Stefan Collini. Not only for yesterday's excellent talk, but also for his equally excellent book. And boringly, I agree with basically all of it, so it's hard to come up with things to say. I will, however, suggest one or two areas in which, because I never knowingly out-pessimismed, things may be even worse than he says, particularly in the UK. I don't have enough experience yet of the Netherlands to know how far this is true here too, having only worked here for a year so far. So a bit earlier on, Caspar said that at the end of these series of short presentations, there would be a free lunch. We know, of course, from Milton Friedman that there is no such thing, so I look forward to the distribution of this impossible object a bit later on. And if Stefan's book has got a theme, it seems to me it is basically the corruption. I'm not sure he uses this word, so I'm wary of putting words into his mouth, but what Michael Sandel has discussed as being the corruption of institutions by the market and the potential corruption of the university by market forces. And as I say, I'm largely in agreement with that. So the direction in which I want to be more pessimistic than Stefan is by suggesting that the market is only the most prominent of a series of adversaries that universities face, and actually which they have always faced and had to deal with. Without going into he's got an excellent overview of the origins of the European university system in his book. I've been doing research recently for a talk I've got to give at a conference next week on the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes's most famous work is Leviathan, which was published in 1651. Shortly after Hobbes died in the early 1680s, Leviathan, which was a book, as Samuel Pepys noted, was a book the bishops will not let be printed again because of its controversial theological and political doctrines, Leviathan was burnt ceremonially by the University of Oxford. Nobody at the time seemed to think that this was a strange thing for a seat of learning to be doing. But of course, Hobbes was, this is controversial, but widely regarded as an atheist, possibly a Unitarian, certainly with highly unusual theological beliefs. And it's a vivid reminder, I think, of the ways in which university life can be suborned by political forces, and in this case, essentially, by the state. Zooming forward, we've only got a few minutes, after Stefan's talk yesterday, I happened, and this was just coincidental, to be looking up the Stephen Slater affair at the University of Illinois. I imagine many people will be familiar with this, but Slater was first offered a job, and then the job was rescinded by the University of Illinois, which was going to be as a professor of Native American Studies, I believe, on the grounds that he had made highly vitriolic comments on Twitter about Israeli action in Gaza, which was going on at this is just over a year ago now. In the wake of that, I mean, the story has progressed since then. The rescission still stands. He hasn't been offered the job again. One of the controversies was whether he had actually been offered the job formally or not, and now emails have been exposed suggesting that indeed he had. But what struck me was a comment by the university board member, Christopher Kennedy. Kennedy, incidentally, is the son of assassinated Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And he said this, I quote, "The university, as the state is a public university, needs in many ways to reflect the values of our state." Needs to reflect the values of our state. Not clear there whether he's talking specifically about the state of Illinois. I imagine he is, or the state in a more general sense. He goes on, and this will pick up on concerns that Stefan airs in his book, quote, "I think we need to be sensitive to taxpayers." I think that is an understandable but misplaced concern, in a sense. I think that there is a legitimate demand for public accountability in universities, but not simply because people pump tax dollars into them. That is one angle from which the accountability demand can be raised, but not the only one. Universities have a social presence. They have power, soft power, to use the Night term. And that in itself incurs a debt of accountability or responsibility, from my point of view. So it's not that the demand for accountability is wrong, it's simply that it has been traduced or debased by its being converted into a purely pecuniary or monetary or fiscal form, as with the person of the taxpayer, which again Stefan mentions in his book as being one of these mythic creatures which now crops up habitually in at least British political discourse as somebody who's outraged that their precious pounds are being squandered on some public project. So just finish off and make two very quick points. One, about what is really the case with universities. I don't think universities have a purpose, right? That may be a controversial view, but in other words, I don't think that there is one single purpose that the university exists to promote. The trouble rhetorically, I think, or the problem rhetorically that we're faced with is that the terms of political argument require us to conduct the debate in those terms. And again, Stefan does a very good job, particularly with regard to the humanities, about how one might make that case. But I think actually the dangers that we face are of attacks from particular quarters, particularly from the state, as well as the state as a spokesperson for the market, and that in defending ourselves, we simply need to push back on that and say we are not here to be the vehicle of any particular interest or interest group, and that is the basis on which university autonomy ought to be understood. However, it's quite hard to make that argument, I think, in the public political sphere without simply looking like one's conducting special pleading or pleading on behalf of a particular sectional interest group. I think that's the pragmatic political problem that we're faced with. But as, again, I think one more point that Stefan makes in his book, quoting John Stuart Mill, Mill says, it's like making a newspaper, writing a newspaper article is like dripping water onto a stone. One drop makes no difference, but you have to keep dripping away. Right? And that dripping away is something which is not going to stop. The need to do that is not going to stop. We're going to have to keep doing it, and what is required, I think, of communicators is certainly diversity. I think this university's record on this is terrible, actually, and we need to be more visibly representative of the society that we're working in, and what morally we need is a suitable reluctance to be bullied. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Two more speakers to go. Our next speaker is Professor Prof Rosenthal, who is Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the Leiden University Medical Center. He won the Spinoza Award in 2003 and also got an honorary doctorate at the Université Descartes in Paris. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure that's all relevant, but what are universities for and who do they belong to? The first question reminded me of when I was in the United States some years ago. I took a ferry across the lake, and it was quite far. So I wandered around, and there was a plaque on the wall with the mission statement of the ferry company, and I read it. And the mission statement was to bring people safely from one shore to the other. Apparently for universities this is more difficult because we need to ask what are they for, but I think well, you've been preaching a little bit to the converted, of course, but that's the usual people to preach to in churches too. Universities are centers of learning, and this learning manifests itself in teaching, research, and in my instance of the medical school, in academic medicine, which is somewhere between medical care and research. Who do universities belong to? Well, that has been, I couldn't agree more with what you said. It belongs to the people. It's a legacy carried forward to future generation. And I think it's, in this country you could like it to some extent to the Rijksmuseum or the Concertgebouw Orchestra. They belong to us all, and they should be there forever. So far not much debate. But then you said something yesterday that has haunted me a bit through the night, perhaps inspired also by the reception and what we got there. But you said, imagine a world without universities, which is a similar question as imagine a world without orchestras or without museums. And of course, those worlds, in theory, could exist, and they have existed in the past. And I think there are threats. And I'm not saying in Europe we have a regime like Pol Pot had in Cambodia, but there is a certain frowning upon learnedness at the moment, which is certainly magnified by the populists that we have in all countries in Europe, basically, at the moment. And it's not new. I know that we had a Minister of Finance 15 years ago, who's now the CEO of the biggest bank of the Netherlands, who once said, why do we need a Concertgebouw Orchestra? People could buy CDs. And of course, you could also say that all music has already been taped once, so why should we tape it again? So there are threats. Now, being from the medical school, I'm slightly practically inclined, so I thought, and I sort of foresaw that everybody would say what I would say otherwise. So I thought, what can we do? So we, the teachers, the researchers, the professors, the students, what can we do to fight these threats? So not talk to the board, but what can we do ourselves? And I think number one is to make the people proud that we exist. Like people are proud there is a Concertgebouw without them even going there. They believe it should be here. The Rijksmuseum should be here. University should be here. So we should explain what we do, and we should involve people. And I don't mean involving like the National Science Agenda, which, well, I don't know if you have looked at the list, but it's utterly ridiculous. And I think what Vincent Icke, astronomer here at the university, said was very correct. He said, well, it's fine, but again, he also made the analogy with the Concertgebouw Orchestra. It's fine if people are involved, but they should not vote on the repertoire of the orchestra. And I think it's the same with science. I'm chairman of the Committee on Scientific Integrity at the LUMC, and I think one of the things we have to do is show integrity and invoke trust. And horrible things happen, and for years people said they happened elsewhere but not in Leiden. Well, they happen in Leiden too, I can assure you. And it's big fraud and small fraud, and that is very, very bad for our public image. And it also shows, I don't even mind so much that these people are bad, but they don't really understand what universities are about, which is the silliness, stupidity is often worse than badness, I feel. But the next thing is we should not, and that's mainly in my field and some other fields, not in all fields, we should not make ridiculous claims to get more money. Last year, the year before, the chairman of the National Cancer Institute appeared on television and basically blackmailed the people to give more money because then they would solve cancer within 5 or 10 years. Well, cancer will not be solved within 5 or 10 years and will not be solved in 20 years. So we should not make those claims. We should explain the painful process of science and the small steps and the replication we need, etc. I think there should be no focus on performance metrics. And you may recall the law of Goodhart, who said whenever a measure becomes an aim, it stops being a measure. Well, that's what's happening. There are all these indices of, I don't know if you know them, but H indices, number of publications, number of citations divided by the number of papers, divided by the average number of citations to average papers in your field. And it doesn't say a thing, it only perverts. Well, maybe it says something, but they should not be used to govern. And, well, one but final, there should be a community sense. So the university belongs to the people, but we are the university. And the university is not there for the researcher and the teacher, but the researcher and the teacher and the professors are there for the university. And there are some of them who like to work in splendid isolation on their research. And that goes back a long time. You remember Archimedes, who said that his circle should not be disturbed, which he was drawing in the sand, while around him the city was destroyed. But of course, these were his last words, supposedly, so maybe that's not the thing to say. And finally, I do believe we need to be accountable, but exactly in the sense as Professor Nuit said, indeed we are paid by public funds, and that does pose a responsibility upon us, which is the responsibility those points I mentioned, and there are many more that you much so eloquently mentioned yesterday. So we have to explain to the taxpayers what we do and why we do it. And the most simple thing is that we teach their children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now turn to the last speaker of today, Professor Paul Wouters. He is a professor of scientometrics and director of the Center for the Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, and he can add another perspective, as he has published, among many other things, on the history of the Science Citation Index, so that might add another important perspective to the current discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm getting hungry, so I will skip most of the politeness, and I will call you Stefan as a summary of Professor Collini. Thanks for your book. Thanks for the lecture. Very valuable, I think. For me, mainly because it points to the importance of language and the effects that particular market-oriented concepts can have to colonize the minds about the goals and missions and practices of the universities. And this has, of course, certainly also been very visible in the capture of scientometrics as a field by misguided university management practices in which performance indicators have become the goal, rather than a very humble piece of information that can be used, if wisely, in the judgment of how universities are developing and to what extent both societies and students are getting what they need. Maybe not what they want, but what they need. So thanks for that. I would like to discuss an assumption in the book, which is explicit in the book, but hidden in the lecture, great lecture by the way. And it's explicit on page 38 in your book. Let me quote, and then I'll try to discuss that in a few minutes. The truth is that the changes that have transformed the landscape of higher education in the past couple of decades have not principally been changes in scholarship and science themselves, but changes in the ways universities are administered, financed, and overseen by their host societies. I understand what the sentence is meant to mean, but I wished it was true. I'm afraid that we are already, certainly in the UK, but also in the Netherlands, a bit farther on the road, where we see a more complex interaction between the way universities are managed and the scholarly practices and bottom-up processes that are steering scientific and scholarship in many different ways. And I think that we must confront, both in terms of analysis and in terms of action, how this interaction is playing out, how it shapes the daily lives of students and scholars and researchers, and also how can we in modern society, which is a different society from 50 years ago, preserve core essential values of the universities and of scholarship in this hyper-competitive, globalized world in which new scientific powers are emerging that give even more weight to performance indicators than is customary in Europe and the UK and US. I see 5 key problems that are both expression of what you could call bottom-up trends in the development of science and scholarship, partly as a result of its success, and partly as a kind of complex interaction between management practices and routines in daily lives of researchers and scholars. So it's partly a kind of corruption, you could say, of the university, but it's also an interesting problem because this interaction also gives the possibility to indeed develop the kind of management practices that Sandra has mentioned, that I wholeheartedly agree with, that are based on the professional autonomy and then influence the management of universities. So certainly in Leiden we have a lot of opportunities here. 5 problems. One is the career structure is very problematic. We need to fundamentally change that. I won't go into it, diversity is only one expression of it. Second, we have a major problem in the way we finance research, not only in terms of its overall investment, but also in its orientation to short-term project funding and the dominance of particular forms of funding, which makes it, for example, more difficult for research in the humanities to be funded in a long-term way. Third, the publication system has gone crazy. This is very clear, we all know it, but it's very difficult to reform. And I think it is possible by using particular forms of open access, not all forms by the way, to fundamentally restructure the publication system in such a way that we start to put real money in real communication rather than in data dumping in rather obscure scientific journals. Although I think the peer review system is very, very valuable and should be maintained because it's the only guarantee of quality that we have. And the fact that the peer review system is also already functioning in problematic ways needs to have a lot of attention, I think. Last, a bottom-up process is the fact that we need more and more information to be able to do state-of-the-art research. We see a process of informatization. And this has all sorts of consequences. For example, a principal investigator needs to be much more of a manager than was necessary in the past. We need to confront it. So I think a simple opposition between scholarship and management is misguided. And last, of course, and I think I should stop there, we need to reorganize the evaluation system, and as CWTS we feel very responsible for that. The general thing, I think the main thing will be to reconnect the way we evaluate post-publication, we evaluate universities, evaluate national systems, reconnect it with the core process of evaluation that's already present in every daily practice of research and scholarship. All researchers and scholars are evaluating all the time. If you read a book, you evaluate the knowledge in it and the information in it with respect to what you already know, and what you know is already in the literature. So professional autonomy is based on a permanent form of qualitative judgment-based evaluation, and we need to reconnect the formal evaluation practices with this core practice, and that will also give more power to the professionals. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this great concluding part of the first series of contributions. A lot of very important themes have been raised in this first round. Diversity, the language of the market, how do we persuade society, accountability, mission statements, career structures, and a lot of other things. And it is going to be a challenge for Stefan to answer all those big issues in 20 minutes after the break, so we are very much looking forward to that. Yesterday in his lecture, Stefan cited a very wise saying in the style of Brecht: first there is lunch, then there is studying. And today we slightly adapt this formulation, so first there is lunch and then there is debating. Whether the lunch is really free or not, that is another issue of debate which we can carry on afterwards. So this famous brown bag lunch will be served outside of this room, and I will explain the procedure to you. There are 2 doors, and you will have to leave this room through one of the doors, the door here near to the desk, and then there will be a brown bag given to you, and you can enter through the other door and return to your seats. And I think this should be possible within 10 minutes. You're all invited for that lunch, and we will resume the program with Stefan's response at 12:30, so 12:30. Thank you very much.
I see this next part of the program is listed as reaction by Stefan Collini, and I was sitting there thinking my reaction is somewhere between wow and oh God, what do I say now? It's really not easy to respond to this. I'm certainly extremely grateful to all the speakers here who've given this such serious attention and expressed such interest in these ideas. I hope they will each not mind if I do not necessarily try to refer to each one in turn, because I thought it might be better if I could select out some more common general themes and deal with it in that way. And that, of course, also absolves me of the obligation to try to pronounce their names, which I don't think I would do very well. Let me begin by trying to summarize what I think are a couple of critical themes present here, which is what I was most hoping for. It's very gratifying, of course, to have agreement or even compliments, but really these issues are taken forward better by our trying to identify areas of disagreement or lack or limitation. And I think the speakers have more than once pointed to 2 particular kinds of limitation both in my book and in the address that I gave yesterday. One is, broadly speaking, I'll come back and try and say something about this. One is, broadly speaking, that I don't say enough about hard organizational questions and about the political processes that are involved in making decisions both about universities and within universities. And the other, possibly related to that, is that there is a great risk of simply preaching to the converted. That those who come, for example, today to any such discussion are those who most likely are already very interested and maybe halfway share a lot of the assumptions, as many of the commentators very kindly said they did today. But obviously, as far as making the case for universities goes, in ways I'll try and touch on briefly, we certainly have to do something other than preach to the converted. Several of the speakers stole lines that I was hoping to use in my response, and one was, of course, that yesterday I was very conscious that I was speaking in a church, and so I felt I was there to preach a sermon, and although the preacher warns you of the dangers of damnation and hellfire, measures such as research assessment are our equivalent of hellfire, I suppose. Nonetheless, the assumption is that those who are present broadly share the faith, and that's why they're there. And I think we should be very careful about not being too complacent or cozy about simply assuming that people will share these premises, and I want to come back to that. I don't pretend that I do have all the answers, and I don't have answers to a lot of organizational questions. As you all know, different university traditions have organized their internal arrangements in very different ways. But I do want to say just a couple of things about organization. One is, I think you still have in the Netherlands an aspect of academic organization, academic self-organization, I would call it, which I think is valuable, and I would very much exhort you to hold on to, because it's an aspect which in Britain, at least, I think we have largely lost. And that is that those senior roles, often played perhaps by deans or vice-rectors or other people, different titles in different places, should, as far as possible, be taken in turn by academics, and those academics should, when their term of office is finished, return to being practicing academics. I think there is immense value for the community, first in having people who are in direct contact with, who are themselves still practicing scholars, and second, in having in the community people who have filled these roles in the past, know something of what the burdens and difficulties are, but also can be there as constructive critics and give good advice. The way in many parts of the world, and particularly in the United States and Britain, these roles have developed is to become a separate career option for those who make what we used to call administration, but actually, of course, we now are enjoined to call management of universities, entirely their career path. And one of the things that's happened in Britain as a result of this is that somebody who, let's say, performs the role, the equivalent of dean in one university, then moves to become, on the strength of that experience, let's call it vice-rector in another university, another senior position in another university, possibly rector or equivalent in another university. And what is lost, I think, there is that contact with the community in which they have roots, in which they are familiar with, and which, in the end, they are answerable to. We understand that there are, of course, some situations in which the external eye and the person who comes with a certain independence has the power to change things, which is difficult for somebody who comes through the ranks of the institution. But by and large, I think several of the issues that were raised very pertinently by the speakers earlier are about our degree of self-government. And there are limits to that, and as I say, I'm not proposing I have any panacea, but I do think that aspect of our taking our turn in these roles is really important. And that means for those who are liable to do this, the academic staff, accepting the sacrifice that involves. You give up your, I speak from bitter experience here, you give up your research time, perhaps you give up a bit of your sleep time too. But it's, I think, beneficial to the university overall, and it's a sacrifice that we ought to regard, I think, as part of the obligation of taking on an academic post. The one other thing I would say that bears on organization is about the question of disciplines and interdisciplinarity, which was touched on earlier. It's very fashionable at the moment to disparage disciplines, to see them as obstructions, to see them as too isolated or inward-looking. And we do understand the reasons for this. But I would urge a little caution. I do think disciplines are the homes of the professional standards and the creation of the next generation of scholars in a way in which those projects which are organized thematically or to address a current societal issue cannot really do. Those sorts of programs, the thematic ones or the topical ones, are in some sense, have to be in some sense, parasitic on the healthy functioning of disciplines. There's great merit in bringing together people from different disciplines, but they have to have a proper training in those disciplines to begin with. And also, I think disciplines are in that sense another aspect of academic self-government, because the tendency for those projects which are organized thematically or to address some pressing social issue is for them to become managerial projects in the pejorative sense. They have their own funding stream quite often. They are actually run by somebody who's not one of the major academics, but by somebody else. And the decisions among a group of practitioners of a field who have some experience of the kind of work that is valuable in that field and who attempt to nurture those standards in the next generation of researchers is something I think universities can't do without. So I would say we should be a little cautious if we move further in the direction, and again, in my view, Britain has moved in many cases too far in this direction. If we move further in the direction of dissolving departments into larger units, call them schools, colleges, whatever, and subdividing those into thematic, project-oriented groups. Along the way, something valuable, I think, risks being lost. Let me now try to turn to the question of our role in trying to muster support for universities. I think it is extremely important to say again, it's been said this morning, I've said it before, but I do want to say again, it's relevant to this discussion, we should not present universities as a sectional interest. This is not a self-interested campaign by those who study or teach in universities. And if we allow it to be represented as such, we have lost half the battle in our engagement with wider publics. One of the reasons why I wanted to stress yesterday and elsewhere that I think what we need to emphasize is the social ownership of universities in this sense. We, teachers and students, occupy particularly important roles on a day-to-day basis in this, but we are not arguing, I think, for something which is our private interest, and we certainly should not let media and politicians represent this as simply a lot of self-interested professors or rebellious students, all the usual stereotypes get mobilized, as looking after their own interests. That is not the case at all. The question of whether, of course, we should be even more pessimistic than I am, I am kind of reassured that there are people more pessimistic than I am in some ways. It is a difficult one. I am not an optimist about short-term political change. I do not think that by anyone like me writing a book or a group of people like us having a good discussion, that we'll wake up tomorrow morning and find that the politics has changed. But if we have any belief in the value of what we do, then I do think we do have an obligation to try to make this case more widely. And several of the speakers earlier talked about the importance of language and the categories that are used, especially in political and media discourse about universities. And we do need, I think, to contest those. We do need to unpack the cliches. We do need to sensitize people to the misdescriptions that get built into this. We do need to show how what looks like a self-evident truth about, for example, universities having impact on society can, in the way those categories are framed and used, actually distort what would be the most valuable contribution of universities to society. There is a constant campaign, I think, to be waged about that. And I'm not entirely pessimistic about the chances of finding some hearing for this. Somebody asked me after yesterday, well, do you find that the Minister for Universities in Britain listens to what you say? Well, it won't surprise you that I think the answer to that is no. Or at least if he does, he doesn't get persuaded. But I do think that there are very large numbers of people in both our societies, the Netherlands and Britain, and in other similar societies, who are not themselves involved in universities directly, but who do have a strong intuitive sense that the current language of economic instrumentalism is not the whole story for universities. Yes, they might, for example, want to be sure that their children are going to have good employment prospects and all those other practical concerns, but also I think I constantly run up against audiences in other parts of society who feel that there should be something here that universities do and have traditionally done, which is now in danger of being lost. So I'm not entirely pessimistic about the prospect of mounting this case and getting some wider support. And in the end, I think this is a political process in the largest sense of that term. It is about changing the language which society uses here, which eventually has some impact upon the whole question of our political representation and then upon the categories which those representatives use. I do not think we should be simply fatalistic about that, and I do not think we should think that there is no ground for support in the wider society, rather to the contrary, if we are willing to make that effort. With this question of language, I think it also, as it were, bounces back internally into our lives in universities. Again, something mentioned by more than one speaker earlier this morning. In my experience, we've come, most of us now who are teachers in universities, have come to operate with a kind of double consciousness on a daily basis. That is to say, we are aware from our professional experience and education of what we think are the real values and the important practices that we pursue, and we want to see those upheld in our everyday decisions. But we're also aware that there are a set of categories, often coming in public systems like yours and mine, often coming from governments, but sometimes from other sources, which we have to accommodate to in some way. I am not suggesting that if, for example, the government, as is the case in Britain, has a system of assessment of research which involves several category confusions, I would say, misdescriptions of what we do. I am not suggesting that we simply try and turn our backs on this. That would be suicidal anyway. But also, as was again said this morning, there is a legitimate social demand for accountability. I don't think we should try and run away from that. But what we do, and what I mean by double consciousness, I think, and especially those of us who have been involved in having to as it were, handle the operation of these systems within universities is keep alive both ways of thinking. I might have to, as it were, translate to my colleagues some of the requirements of some of these external assessment or bureaucratic or other requirements. I might have to translate those and say, we've got to do it, we've got to find a way to give answers that fit these categories. At the same time, keeping alive, perhaps in that very same conversation with that same colleague or group of colleagues, a vocabulary which says, I also understand that's not how we think about it most of the time, and that what you are really doing is what matters. In other words, in case of, for example, assessment of research, to say, I have the responsibility, as I recently have had, to make the return for our faculty about our research and our publications, and here's what I need from you, and here's the categories they require. We've got to do it. But I understand that really you must get on with your research in the way that seems to you most valuable, and you must take your time over it if it requires time. And I and the other people temporarily holding this job will attempt to translate as far as you've got into the categories which, if you took them literally, would demand such short-term returns. That's what I mean by double consciousness within the institution. Because if we don't, and again the phrase was used earlier this morning, if we don't, these categories colonize our minds. We do start to inhabit them, we do then start to act in accordance with them, we start to define ourselves in their terms. And I think it's really important to keep alive the other terms. Something else that was touched on this morning, I'm going to be very brief, is about career structure, and I do agree with this, and this is a very hard topic for us, I think. Every development in the last 2 or 3 decades, I think, has emphasized research as the main determinant of career progress, and a particular structure of publications as the main way to evaluate that progress. And both of those are flawed or have their damaging aspects. One of the ways which I think this is particularly damaging, and I am ignorant of how this operates exactly in the Netherlands, but I suspect it's very similar to what I'm familiar with, is that it is increasingly becoming the case that the success of an academic is measured by how much time they are away from teaching or even away from their own institution. The newsletter in so many universities now carries the little congratulatory paragraph and the little bad photograph, which says, here's somebody who's won this award and they will now be on leave for 2 years, and university is very proud of them. Well, of course we understand everything about why that is the case. But it's become almost exclusively, certainly the dominant criterion for governing an academic career. I think it's very hard for anyone, for example, anyone under 40, let's say, not to think that the measure of how good they are as an academic is the amount of external funding they obtain. And we really need, I think, to change that practice and challenge that assumption. If not, what in the long run I think may happen, among many other changes, is that students will have a very good ground for resenting the fact that those who appear on, as it were, the faculty list as being the glories of their department or their university are never there, and that the actual teaching is done by other people, often less well qualified people. That's a collective problem to address, but I agree, I think it is a real problem. And finally, a phrase used, which I much appreciate from this morning, that we should not exaggerate our claims. I do think this is enormously important. I'm well aware that if you start to write a book called What Are Universities For?, you're heading down the same suicidal cul-de-sac as the poor public relations officer in that ferry company referred to earlier, that you risk coming up with either a tautology or else a claim that you have here the recipe for making everybody much, much nicer. Well, that's not what universities are for, and I think we should be very careful about tying our aspiration for universities to a whole range of what are currently very important values for us as a society. Sometimes the phrase social mobility is used here, sometimes some notion of improving our ethical awareness, treatment of others, recognition of their rights, matters of that kind. These are great values. I'm not disparaging these values, and I'm hoping university practices do not in any way reduce or damage them. But I do not think we should put, if I can use this metaphor, all our eggs in that basket. Because in the end, the sort of academic practices that we pursue are, I think, not about making people nicer or better, and that those external measures of things, for example, like social mobility, are in fact a little like those external measures such as contributing to productivity and the gross domestic product. They are byproducts which may be desirable. In the case of social mobility or whatever, they certainly are. But they're not what universities are for. That's not part of the ferry company's mission statement in this case. And so I think a little modesty on our part about this, a little recognition that we are not the engine for the entire transformation of societies, but we have certain more specific tasks that we've touched on in the last 2 days, and that's the terms in which the case should most be made. I just want to end, this is a very predictable line to adopt, I know, but I can't resist it. I just want to end by saying, not only, of course, am I very cheered and gratified by the level of interest in the last couple of days and the things we've been talking about, but I think some such set of debates in which people feel willing to speak, I hope, freely, critically, are what universities are for. We're very privileged to operate in institutions which can treat this as part of our natural proceedings. This is not, as it were, time out. This is not a leisure activity for us. This actually is one of the things we think that we do professionally, collectively, as teachers and students. So even events like this, I think, really should be treasured for that reason, and I'm certainly very grateful for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for clarifying your arguments and bringing this discussion a step further again, and for raising some very important points in reaction to the speaker's contribution about disciplines and about the language that we use, and also about careers, several other points. And I'm sure that there are many people in the audience who would like to respond to these points. I'm also sure that many of the speakers of the first round would like to answer this answer, but I think it would be good if we first give the opportunity to those people who have not yet opened their mouth except for the lunch that they got to say something. And I would just like to repeat that I would like to ask you to stand up and to briefly introduce yourself. You will get the microphone, and please keep your statement to the point. So is there anybody in the room who would like to say something now? Yes.
Hello. Sorry, my name is Steven Kruiswijk. I'm an independent music technologist here from Leiden. I was at the speech yesterday in the church and was very intrigued by a lot of stuff. One of the main things I think is very intriguing is that this economic instrumentalism that you talk about is of course not only an issue at hand for universities but for society at large. So one of the points I like is that this is a very big and broad general challenge for which I guess universities are in a sense equipped, right? This is a big law faculty, used to be the place where instruments were made. So one of my questions to you would be, do you think that if coming from the language of economic instrumentalism, is it typically a challenge for a university to come to something as a universal instrumentalism, which can engender the values of social ownership, you know, something which is larger than what you said yesterday of private ownership, which is exclusive and personal and enforceable. So I personally am very intrigued by this topic of how we can also, you know, in coming to a alternative for NPM or all these metrics, can we use metrics? Can we use money also to express more than private interest? And would that not be a very interesting kernel of functionality to add to society? Thank you.
Perhaps I could just begin by saying that I hope not all questions have to be addressed to me. There were a lot of interesting speeches this morning, and maybe people want to answer each other, so I don't necessarily feel I should respond to everything, but this one clearly was addressed to me, so I will try quickly to respond. I think where you begin is quite right. Obviously, what we're dealing with here is something which is a feature of very, very general economic development, social and economic development, in especially the last generation or so. It's not confined to universities by any means. And the mechanisms that I've been touching on occasionally, mechanisms about accountability or the kinds of things that were mentioned this morning about new public management, of course actually have their origins outside universities and are much more widely applied. And I'm certainly not denying that some of the thinking that has gone into these can improve public services, for example, in some ways. There may be now more consultation of users of public services than was once the case, and that can produce certain benefits. But I guess what I want to emphasize principally, and it's of course a risk of I repeat myself, but what I want to emphasize principally is that the prime activities of universities are difficult to assimilate to a model which relies upon the economic agent buying and the economic producer selling. Difficult in all kinds of ways, but that includes that sort of user consultation that is such a feature of recent forms of accountability in public services is also hard to apply. You know, asking users of a rail service what they valued about punctuality or cleanliness of the trains and so on may produce some answers which are somewhat useful and certainly which are quantifiable. Asking, can we speak of users of an education, what they value, may produce some information that is useful, although very hard to quantify, and some quantifiable information which it's not always terribly useful or appropriate. So I think my response is to recognize that universities are only one of the many social institutions which are subject to and engage with these economic categories and the forms of measurement that often come with them, but that universities, not uniquely, but universities do particularly provide difficulties for these categories, and that the society at large, and especially perhaps politicians who have promoted the application of them to universities, are not altogether aware of how difficult the fit between those categories and our activities are. That's what I did.
Thank you very much. There is a second question over here.
Hello, my name is Erik Beren, Cultural Anthropology. I would like to respond to your response regarding the role of the university in transforming society and whether it should contribute to empowerment and changing society. And you plea, very understandably so, for a very humble position regarding that. But I wanted to add another one, except if you want to do that and how important you feel that is politically to transform society from university. I think there's also an issue of epistemology and legitimacy. The epistemology is that we all know by now that we need to be reflexive about the production of knowledge. We as researchers are part of that. So if you want to increase and enhance knowledge, I think the issue of diversity is key. So it's not only an issue of social transformation, it is also about acquiring better knowledge from a reflexive point of view. And the second point, I think is very key, is the legitimacy of institutions. A lot of institutions have lost legitimacy. Churches, political parties, unions, we can go on for quite some time and then universities follow. And I think the legitimacy of universities has a lot to do with representing diversity. And that, I think, is another key issue to put this on the agenda very, very centrally.
Okay, thank you very much, because I agree with that, and perhaps the fact that you felt you should make that point means I didn't make it very clearly myself, rather than the contrary. I agree entirely with both of the aspects of what you say there. All I wanted to say is that while that is true, I do not think that we should try to make the case, as it were, mission statement case for universities in terms of the priority of those social effects. I agree with you entirely about the epistemological point. This is a matter of what ranges of experience we can draw on in the formulating of our knowledges. And I agree with you about the legitimacy that, just as I was saying earlier, that I think society needs in some sense to recognize itself in universities. Then that means also recognizing the diversity of society. But still, and I don't know if you and I disagree at all in the end about this, but still I think I want to caution us not to make those our main justifications. And after all, many other, possibly most other social institutions should be doing the same things in those respects, whereas some of the things we do are perhaps uniquely or anyway especially done in universities, and that's the argument or message I would concentrate on.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Danny Van Dam. I'm a Leiden alumna and PhD in English Literature at Cardiff University. And I wanted to ask, what you see in the Netherlands and what I think you also see in the UK is a movement that university should be accessible to everyone, which I think is very valid, but that also means that everyone should be able to get through to finishing university education, which is challenging in a sense of the level you expect from university students, and I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on this.
Yes. Well, I don't think I have a distinctive opinion about this, but I quite see why it's a question, especially at the moment. Let me say one thing, which is not quite, I'll start with a point you didn't quite start with. I do think that the more the process of funding emphasizes the consumer model, the student who is buying something, the more insistence there will be that what they are entitled to is a good quality qualification, and that means getting high marks. And I think this is already a problem for universities. It's, as many of you perhaps know, it's a really live problem in the United States. The student who knocks on the professor's door afterwards and says, "I've paid money for this course, I'm not getting a B." Well, those are only anecdotal stories, but I think that is a real difficulty. So, to turn it to the terms in which you ask, universities should do their best to make sure their filter procedures for entry and for remaining in the university mean that those who do get in and stay the course are judged to be capable of getting the qualification. We do nobody any kindness by lying about that at the early stage. But we ought to have procedures which are thorough enough to make sure that if somebody is kept in the university and keeps passing each of the hurdles, then they will be of a capacity to get the qualification at the end of it. But you're going to predict what I'm going to say in closing. We abandon our sense that there are important standards here to be maintained in assessment of student performance. We abandon that at our peril. The qualifications become meaningless. There opens up an absurd divide between what we internally think as scholars and teachers when we're trying to explain some topic or what counts as good work in some topic, and then our assessment practices of individual students where we abandon that. That would be, I think, incapacitating for us as teachers and scholars. And so, although it's, as the intake to universities becomes larger and more democratic, it becomes phrased sometimes as a question of rights, the student's right in this respect, and students certainly have several rights which are relevant, but in the end, I do not think we should act as though they have the right to the top level of mark. They have the right to be helped to take that assessment level as well as they can, and the marks will have to follow as it turns out.
Thank you. I can imagine that some of the speakers of our first round would also like to react on these questions that has been raised so far. So just let me know if you would like to interfere or participate. Yes, Alex Geurt.
Thanks. Yeah, just to follow up a little bit on what you were saying about the importance of discipline. Here at Leiden we have, especially in the humanities, we have a long tradition of having departments which are built around what they call language and culture. Now those are not strictly speaking disciplinary departments. Actually they're the opposite, if you will. They're based around regions or cultural areas, if you will, in the present or in the past. And probably one of the reasons for their existence relates back to the fact that a proper understanding of a region or a culture starts with managing and understanding the language, or the languages that are spoken in that area. Now, there have been some shifts in this thinking, right? And it relates in one way, although not entirely overlaps with area studies thinking. And I myself, as you know, come from a very different disciplinary background, right? I work at a faculty of archaeology, which in the title alone already defines itself as a very disciplinary with a capital D faculty. And at the same time, I also find myself confronted with the problem that I can't really teach students in depth about particular cultural phenomena worldwide, and we aspire to do a world archaeology at Leiden, so not just a local one, without proper understanding of culture and language. So in relation to what you say about the importance of discipline, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose I partly want to distinguish some arrangements that we may adopt for organizational purposes, and in particular where we root graduate and PhD training and education. Personally, I think it's very difficult to root that preparation for a scholarly career in anything except disciplines. I don't say it's impossible, but I think it's difficult. I taught for a number of years at the University of Sussex, indeed where Glenn Nuit also taught at a period. And Sussex had attempted to, in some sense, transcend disciplines, and I taught in a school of European studies, which rather, as you imply, though in this case it was several languages, but it was a school which attempted to study the culture and politics and language and literature of particular countries and within a European framework, rather than to have a department of English or a department of French and so on. It was very exciting teaching, and I don't know about my students, I enjoyed it a lot. I do not think it was a unit which, as it were, could perpetuate itself in scholarly terms. It relied upon traditional PhD programs producing top-level scholars of French literature or students of German politics or whatever. And that's the only point that I would make. I mean, I entirely agree that if we're talking about broadly the humanities and some of the social sciences, the kind of cultural immersion in one particular society or set of societies and its language is essential, and that might be shared by people who, you know, some of them might be political scientists, some of them might be literary critics. But I think that somewhere along the line, and as I say, there can be different stages of organization for different things, but somewhere along the line, We want those people to have experienced and been subjected to the most rigorous judgment of people who practice the same craft in particular, as well as the other cultural range they might have, who practice that craft in particular and apply its standards. And for that reason, as I said, I just think we should be cautious about letting these interesting ideas about organization, these often very important ideas for addressing contemporary social problems, we should just not let them entirely overbalance the existence of departments, because as far as universities' medium and long-term future goes, departments seem to me very fundamental. I'll just very quickly say, since all these debates about universities, so much is made of supposed American models. There's no such thing as one American model. It's a very diverse system. But it is very striking, I think, how durable departments have been in American research universities and how powerful. Now, the power may be for good and for ill in some respects, but I do think if we're talking about what conduces to scholarly intellectual quality and in the world today thereby to the standing or reputation of the top universities, I have to say I think a flourishing disciplinary department is a very important element.
We've got a question over here.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Ting Feng. I'm a Chinese guy here, and I'm majoring in sociology. And I'm focusing on the organization studies, and I chose the university governance as my topic. And I have two questions here. One is, how do you think the university governance system will be influenced by the political factors, which...
Sorry, I missed one word there. How did I think university governance
system will be influenced by the political factors? So we think like the autonomy is pursued by every universities, but we cannot ignore the influence exerted by the governance or the political system. Maybe the administrative system of the university be a duplication of the political system, but not totally. And another one question here is, Professor Paul Voter had mentioned about the evaluation system should be reorganized. And for the Netherlands, it's the NVAO and the VSNU. So maybe these two organizations are always international oriented and they always evaluated the courses in the Belgium. So do you think the evaluations organization should be more international oriented or just pay more attention to the domestic perspective? Thanks.
I don't know what I think about your first question, to be honest. I certainly don't think that, but I'm not suggesting you imply this, but I certainly don't think that the structures that have developed in national governments and have been increasingly developed in the last generation can in any sense be replicated within universities or should be. I don't think we have that sort of activity to control. Where I would say that the traditional structures of universities still may lag behind what is the ethos of our political cultures more generally, and this was something touched on this morning, I think is in the question of the perceived democratic quality of our internal organization. It's, and I say this as a piece of self-criticism in part, it's all very well to talk about academic self-government and academic autonomy, but as we know, that has tended to mean government by a set of senior male professors. And apart from the question of diversity, I think there is a serious issue about the representation of other groups, including, and not confining it to, but including junior faculty. Most of the language of this debate actually, I think, rather elides that. And so I think that sense that there is or should be or was once a kind of entitled elite who made these decisions and everyone else accepted them, which after all, if we go back far enough, probably was the one quick characterization of the political cultures of 19th and early 20th century Europe. That ethos has perhaps lingered on a little too long in universities, or its vestiges have, and I do think we need to address that. But I don't otherwise, I have to say, I apologize, but I don't otherwise have a view really about any symmetry or replication of external government organization and procedures to their translation within universities. Can I just get clear with your second question? Is this a question principally about evaluation, or could you just elaborate what for you is, as it were, at stake in the question?
I think because in the European countries, the higher education system are totally different, or focusing on the different.
Okay.
So maybe if the evaluation system just try to imitate others, or focusing on not paying enough attention to domestic, but always try to look around to outside, maybe is not appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I see more clearly your concern. I'm actually a little skeptical about this. That is to say, scholarship and science is inherently international. It makes no sense, I think, actually, to talk about developing a British physics or a German economics, as it were, even though there are sometimes national schools or traditions. And so inevitably we draw upon, as far as people are able, the best work from wherever it comes. But we have to recognize, I think, that there are limits to this in practical and political terms in particular, and this might even go back to that figure I've otherwise, as has been pointed out, I've otherwise had my fun with, but who is nonetheless a real figure, the taxpayer. That is to say, what is being supported is simultaneously a contribution to an international enterprise of science and scholarship, but also to a certain national set of preoccupations or concerns. And it seems to me to make perfect sense to think that universities in different countries will have some different things to focus on in that way, and that may mean that they ought to have in part, only in part, but in part, a system of evaluation or assessment which recognizes that difference. Let me take a very small example. This is not from your field, but nearer to mine, but one of the risks of a complete internationalization of evaluation is that small countries with languages which are not widely spoken quite soon stop registering in the international indices of scholarly achievement because they don't get enough widespread recognition. So somebody who works on, let's say, English literature can have evaluations from all over the world attesting how important their work is. And the relevant committee will say, well, that's great, he's very widely recognized, we'll give them the grant or promote them or whatever. Somebody who works on Welsh literature is not going to find that. There's nobody in most parts of the world who will do that. I don't want to see them always lose out in any system of funding. At the same time, we want them to conduct their study of Welsh literature in accordance with the highest standards of criticism. We have to find a way, I think, which is often a nationally specific way, to acknowledge those particularities. And in that respect, at least, and this may apply much more to the humanities than to the natural sciences, certainly, and maybe even to the social sciences, in that respect, I think we do not want to go down the route of having a totally uniform international system of evaluation, because there will be casualties which we do not want to incur.
Thank you. There is another contribution over here, I think.
My name is De Jonge. I'm an emeritus professor of this university. I've worked in the Department of Religious Studies. As you know, the Dutch universities are mainly funded by the state. The budget each university gets is strongly determined by the numbers of BA students, BA diplomas, PhD graduations, and our relative share in the funding by state research councils. This dependency on numbers and quantities should probably be diminished if we want to get more space, more room, more air, and more time for really academic teaching and exchange and research. Now, how do you think we can attain this diminishment of dependency on numbers, and especially what are the alternatives, the alternative criteria or parameters for financing the university?
I'm grateful to you. Well, I'm to some extent grateful to you for the question. But you know, I think if I really had the answer, I'd be the universal world Minister of Education. I don't have an answer, to be honest, to this. One of the small things I will say, though, by way of addressing your question, is that I do think it's important that universities themselves do not adopt a system of internal accounting which prevents them from making academic decisions. That's to say, for a long time, one of the ways in which a university would use its own, wherever the source of funds from outside would use its funds, might involve what we call the cross-subsidy from one subject to another. That seems to me a very valuable aspect because it involves making academic judgments about what you want to teach and to do research in. And also it involves taking a long-term view, that it's worth, for example, keeping alive a certain branch of scholarship, even though at the moment the numbers may be quite low. One of the great difficulties, which I suspect from your question you're well aware of, about the direct tying the internal use of funding directly to especially student numbers, undergraduate student numbers in this way, is first of all that actually what it's being tied to is the choice of maybe 16 or 17-year-olds at school, because choices are made quite early about what to study, not always very well-informed choices, and if a university has to react in the very short term to a fluctuation in those numbers, has to decide it's no longer economically possible or rational to maintain that small department and has to close it. There's no guarantee, of course, that in fact if it had kept it going for some more years, the numbers would go up again. I mean, there are some cases where we think that's not likely, but there are some cases where it certainly has happened. So I do think it's in our collective interest in universities to not simply replicate internally the system of subdivision which is used externally to allocate or decide on the amount of money that we get. I suppose in practice one other way in which these days universities do their best to mitigate some of the possibly somewhat damaging or divisive effects of these external metrics, or well, they're not metrics of funding, but these external mechanisms of funding, is that we do, as far as possible, I think, use some of the funds we get for research in as general a way as the terms of the funding will permit. And this, of course, can include financing PhD students, for example. It's become increasingly the case, I think, not just those studentships which are tied to a particular grant, but that in the internal budget of a university, some of the money from the external grant can be used in this way to support graduate education in those fields. Again, you'll see that my inclination in both these cases is to try as far as possible to make the academic decision first and find ways to redirect the money to fit that rather than letting the mechanism drive it the other way around. But there's no question that, you know, eventually numbers have their impact. I mean, to take one of the most obvious long-term cases, it would have been, I think, I mean, if we could imagine ourselves in this university or one like it 100 years ago, it would have been, I think, to many people present then, unimaginable that Greek and Latin would not have been among the major studies, numerically widest diffuse studies of that university, a university like Leiden or a university like Cambridge. But that has changed dramatically in all universities. Classics is a very, very healthy field now, I think, but a smaller one, a much smaller one. And many places that used to teach it don't teach it. Those social changes eventually have to be accommodated. That's not just a matter of a funding mechanism. Those are very widespread changes in conceptions of social class and relation to other subjects and so on. So I don't think we can put our head in the sand about that. But in the short term, I suggest that universities should try and do everything they can to subordinate the mechanism by which money comes to them to their internal judgments of academic value.
Thank you very much for this rich response, Stefan. We are slowly moving, I think, to the end of this meeting. Perhaps I could ask a final, little bit more practical question to conclude this debate. So a lot of points have been raised today, and I think I felt, although there are different perspectives, that there's also a lot of agreement between a lot of people in this room about how things should be done, or at least about the problems that we face in career perspectives, in funding, in the language that we use. Perhaps I could ask you how you would advise us as a community present here, but also the larger Leiden University community, to, beyond this debate, to go on thinking about these questions, how we should deal with them in a way that is really going to change something. Because as I also notice, although there is a lot of agreement, I also have the feeling that many people feel that it is difficult to change things, to persuade society or the government. I think that it would help if we find a way to have more energy, perhaps, and to go on with asking these questions. And I would like to ask you whether you would have any specific advice on how we can go on after this meeting today.
Short answer, no. I'm afraid. I wish I did, and if I did, I would follow it myself. Also, I have to say, I mean, I hope it's obvious, but I certainly don't presume that somebody like me should come in from somewhere else and tell you how to conduct this business in the Netherlands. Not at all. I suppose the only response I would give is one that you would already anticipate. And that is, I think, it's very difficult not to become too dispirited or too fatalistic about these changes. And one of the ways in which that manifests itself, I think, within universities is the feeling, well, at least if in most of the time, talking now of other scholars, I can get on with my research, my writing, my experiments, at least if most of the time I can teach students in a way which I think stimulates and benefits them, then, well, you know, we'll have to let the larger arrangements be whatever they're going to be. Those are for other people to organize. And anyway, there's no way I can influence them. All I would say is I think that isn't true. And I think it's particularly not true at this moment in history where the conjunction of a very positive and welcome and admirable degree of democratic enfranchisement goes along with a not so admirable short-termism about measuring results. We, who are the ones often subject to this, I think now have to speak out about this more than we did. We now have to try our best to take every opportunity provided by the media, opportunity provided by public meetings, to try to explain why we think things are at risk here, which, as I said before, I believe, and I would like to encourage you to believe, large sections of society agree with us, are very valuable about universities, and that we should not lose. So really, it's not exactly a practical suggestion, but it's a suggestion about not losing heart. We do have a very strong message to put. We still are, I think, both staff and students, we still are in a very privileged position working in universities and studying in universities. But maybe we should feel more strongly than in the past the obligation to try to communicate this set of arguments and to engage wider publics in our support, their support in the long run, and making that case in social terms. not very practical, but I'm afraid, you know, when you're preaching to the choir, it's not so practical.
It's a very inspiring answer, and I thank you again for this contribution, but also for all your stimulating responses and the points you have raised yesterday and today. Before we thank you officially, I would like to invite Professor Burton Deck to officially close this meeting. I think we can say that we have not perhaps reached all the answers that we were looking for. The question that was asked today, who does the university belong to, does not seem to have a real and obvious or clear answer. But what we have seen today, I think that's very important to do this kind of debate and to learn from each other. And I hope that this will not be the end of the debate, but actually the beginning of a series of debates that we will be having in this university in the coming weeks and months. And I'm very grateful to the executive board for organizing this debate, and I'm very happy to invite Professor Burton Deck once more to address us.
Something here that looks like a fridge, but it isn't, but the door keeps opening. Okay. Thank you, Casper, and thank you all for being here, and of course thank you speakers from Leiden University. Thank you. Stefan, where are you? Oh, there you are. You're modestly hiding. This has been an amazing experience for me. I almost every day think I have the best job in the world, but on days like this I know that that's a fact, a scientific fact. It's amazing how much energy and commitment and dedication and brain power resides in this university, how much of it we've seen today, how open the debate has been. And I really am very grateful for Stefan's last comments, his closing statements, which voice such an optimism. And I feel that too, very much so. Universities may feel like they're under threat, that may also feel the same way in the Netherlands often. But I think Leiden University has a key role to play in Dutch politics. We are in a very good position to change the problems that we face, namely the problems of misunderstanding, of accountability applied the wrong way. And I really would urge all of you and the academic community that wasn't here today to join us in this effort to stay together as a group and to defend the universal values of a university. Because one thing that has become so clear in the debate today is that we are an enormously successful business, if you want to call it that way. There is no doubt in all of our minds, including mine, that what we're doing is valuable, that people who are working for the university are incredibly diligent and hardworking and give their everything to training students, to doing the research that's important for the world of tomorrow. So we have nothing to fear. We have every reason to be incredibly proud. And if the outside world, the government, the taxpayer, whoever he or she may be, doesn't always understand what we're doing, I think it's our job to make them understand. And if I would have to choose one word that I heard a lot today, if we would do a word cloud, I think language was a word that was used a lot, which I think is also very fitting. We are a comprehensive university. We saw 7 faculties here, people from 7 different disciplines. But language is the key to all the things we need to do. Language, communication, explaining, drawing people in from the outside, also explaining inside. And I think it also shows the importance of social sciences and humanities in everything we do. One thing that I remember from what Stefan was saying was this double consciousness that you mentioned, and that's something I feel a lot myself. I know what everybody's doing here is incredibly valuable and wonderful. You know very well how to teach. You know what to do to train your students to become the global citizens of tomorrow. But very, very frequently you feel that the leadership of the university and behind that group, the government is asking you to show what you're doing in ways that just doesn't fit what you feel in your heart is the core of what you're doing. So this double consciousness, where on the one hand there's these very valuable activities, and on the other hand there are the checklists that are being asked. I feel that too a lot. And I think we need to be careful, all of us, and you need to help me protect all of us, that the double consciousness doesn't become something really painful and doesn't morph into schizophrenia, because then I think we're doing something really wrong. And then there will be a tendency to actually use what the government and the accreditation organization and everybody else is asking us to do to also conduct our business inside. And when we do that, I think we lose the heart of our university. And I'm convinced that if we do this in Leiden as an academic community, if all of us use our collective brain power, if this is the first meeting of a whole series of meetings where we get more and more of our colleagues and students involved, then we can actually be a veritable force. And I know we can then influence the government and the parliamentarians and the Dutch population, and maybe even beyond that, because it is an international issue. So I'm already thinking of very practical things we could do after this meeting, and this will just hopefully be the first of many, and we'll keep talking about your visit to Leiden, Stefan, and we'll say that was the starting point of this very important movement. Because what happened in Amsterdam at the university there, I think, is that the administration, the students and the teachers didn't form this very strong community. And I think at Leiden we can really do that. So I think I totally agree. We have the obligation to try and communicate. We shouldn't be fatalistic. And I want to thank you all for so candidly sharing all your opinions, your intellectual capabilities, and your very critical, constructive comments with each other and also with me. And I think it's my role as a university administrator to make sure that we carry this on and that this gets communicated to the powers at be. So I'll definitely do that. And again, I want to express my thanks to all of you, but not in the least to Casper, who has done so much work and as a true academic has done it just because he finds it important. I'm going to give you a little present, but of course that's in absolutely no comparison to the enormous amount of energy you've put in. But since you are an academic, I know you're not going to mind. So I want an applause for Casper's effort, because he's put something really valuable together. Thank you, Casper. And thanks, Stefan. I think you've been far too modest. Your kind of thinking is so incredibly influential, and we're going to use this to inspire us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simone. I would just like to add thank you to all the speakers of today and the participants in the audience. It was a great pleasure. I also would like to thank Ans Kluit and Rosalien van der Poel, who did actually all the organization. I didn't do anything, they did everything, so thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the continuation of this debate. Thank you all and have a good academic year.